Hello and welcome to IO Thinker, where international affairs are discussed. I'm Martin Zupko. Today we have the honor of interviewing Professor Chandran Kukathas, a distinguished political theorist renowned for his contribution to liberalism, multiculturalism, and the philosophy of freedom. His seminal work, A Theory of Diversity and Freedom, offers profound insights into managing societal diversity through the principles of liberal pluralism and minimal state intervention. We look forward to exploring Professor Kukathas' perspectives on the complexities of culture coexistence and the future of liberal democratic societies. Hello, Professor Chandran Kukathas.
Hello, Martin. Nice to be here.
Professor Chandran Kukathas is a Lee Kong Chan Chair Professor of Political Science at the School of Social Sciences, Singapore Management University. He was head Department of Government at the London School of Economics and Political Science from 2015 to 2019. Before his appointment at LSE, Chandran was Neil A. Maxwell Professor of Political Theory, Public Policy, and Public Service at the University of Utah, and has taught at the University of New South Wales, Oxford University, and Australian National University. And also he is dealing with the Hayek's political philosophy, which is very interesting as well. Chandran is a prolific writer and has published extensively in leading academic journals. So that's excellent introduction of our guest today. And I would like to start with the first and maybe the basic question. When we say a theory of diversity and freedom, how did you come to this term? What was at the beginning? What was the initial moment that you decided to work on such a project? And this is the outcome of your work.
There wasn't a critical moment when I made the decision. It's more that over the years, I have been interested in a range of different questions which maybe reflect my own history or background. I grew up in Malaysia in a society in which there were strong preferential policies to favor the majority Malay community. And as someone of Sri Lankan Tamil descent, I was in the minority. And so this was always a subject that was a topic of conversation in the house. When I was 12, I moved to Australia, and there I became very interested in Aboriginal history and Aboriginal politics, because the Aboriginal people were at the same time also, in some ways, the victims of their own colonial settlement, and victims of the transition to the modern world. And I thought their condition was one of deep injustice. So I had two conflicting sensibilities. On the one hand, I thought that this particular cultural minority needed some kind of support and protection. But on the other hand, I was unsympathetic to the idea of group rights and preferential policies, because I had myself been affected by this. So over the years, this is something I thought about a lot. When I went to Oxford to do a PhD, I wrote on F.A. Hayek and his philosophy of freedom. So the idea of freedom was also in the background when I was thinking about these things. So I'd always thought that eventually I would come to write on the question of cultural diversity, because I was just interested in it from a very, very early age. And as it happened, Will Kimmaker published his book on liberalism, community, and culture. And so I engaged with that, and that became a paper, and then eventually a book trying to explore these ideas. So there wasn't a critical moment when I decided, okay, I'm now going to work on this subject. It really arose organically from my own history.
So let's briefly introduce the theory, and then we can maybe put it into the context of the international relations theories. Like where do you fit?
So the view that I've developed has its most complete statement in the book you've mentioned, The Liberal Archipelago. The subtitle is A Theory of Diversity and Freedom. The title, The Liberal Archipelago, perhaps is the the best way to think about the nature of the theory, because in describing the world, or the political world, as an archipelago, what I wanted to suggest is that the world, and not only internationally but within nations, is best conceived of as a kind of association of different communities. Societies are not unitary, but they're made up of different components, that is to say, different forms of association with different cultural, religious, ethnic, and ultimately ethical convictions or attachments. So in order to understand the world, I think what we need to understand is how it is that all these different components relate to one another. Now, one view is that they are best understood and ought to be somehow unified, at least within the nation, as a single kind of ethical entity. What I wanted to suggest in my book is that if a society is going to be a free society, then what it has to do is to recognize the diversity of ethical, religious, ethnic, cultural identities within that society, and ask how should all of these different components relate to one another if we could still see that society as free. Okay? And my answer essentially is to say it would be a free society if the relations among these different communities was not one that tried to enforce or create a kind of unity, but was one in which people were free to move within and between these different communities according to their own ethical and cultural convictions. So one way to think about this is to think of a society as something like a collection of islands, an archipelago. But what's distinctive about this is that there is freedom for people to move between these different places. Now, within each of these components, of course, one mustn't assume that everybody within those societies is completely in agreement with everything within it, because all societies, small or large, exhibit tensions. Most of the time when people live together, they live together in a way that evinces compromises, because not everybody thinks the same way. The reason that they don't move to a better place sometimes is that there are trade-offs involved. If you move to another place, you may have some of the things you are looking for, but less of something else. So the way to think about a society is to think of it in this way, as something that's much more fluid than most political theories have suggested. To my mind, in the history of political thought, most thinkers have tried to suggest that a political society in the modern world of the nation state has to be much more of a kind of social unity than I think is necessary. Of course, you do need some institutional structures. You do need to have rules and norms in order to organize the relations among different communities. But I want to suggest that this is much more fluid. I think the disagreements with me come mostly from people who think that I've overstated this. Obviously, I think I haven't. I think this is the way the world is. And I think attempts to regularize and enforce a kind of social unity and conformity is what is most antithetical to freedom.
Excellent. And Professor Kukathas, some students might be wondering, is this going to liberalism, realism, constructivism? Where you see your position within the IR theories?
Okay. So I think of myself as liberal. So what I've advanced is a liberal political theory. But liberalism is a very, very broad and capacious term, and all sorts of people claim the term liberal for their own. I haven't tried to suggest that this is the only interpretation of liberalism or that this is the correct one. I don't see any great value in this, but I think that's the term that would orient me to the existing terminology. As far as the other terms are concerned in international relations theory, whether it's constructivism or realism, I haven't really had very much to say. In political life, I think, of course, one has to be reasonably mindful of political reality. That's, I think, something that I take as a given. So nothing that I've written suggests that there is a program that we can simply implement or a set of institutions that we can simply create. Political life is complicated. There are all kinds of factors that will shape and affect any kind of political decision-making, whether it's in the legislature or in the executive or in the judiciary or within political parties. And I don't have anything to say about that through the theory that I've advanced here, although I may have things to say about this independently.
Naturally, there are questions coming when we read your theory and we heard the introduction. So let's go through some more specific concepts. And the first one is the notion of state sovereignty. As you were speaking about the communities as islands, people might be thinking, how is your view on the state sovereignty? Like, what does it mean in your theory? And is there any role for the state sovereignty in your theory?
In the book, I simply recognize the fact of the existence of states with claims to sovereign authority. What I want to say, though, is that in thinking about sovereignty, one should not assume that sovereignty is a fixed and straightforward matter. States are sovereign to varying degrees. Not all states are as sovereign as some others might be. The extent to which states are sovereign depends upon their actual power in the real world, but also the institutional structures within which they're embedded. And all states nowadays are, to some degree, interrelated through their commitments to international institutions, whether it's by membership of the United Nations or participation in things like in international regimes such as the International Refugee Convention. All states are interrelated. So a state like the United States, for example, has much more sovereign power, much more capacity to shape its own actions vis-a-vis other states and to control matters within their boundaries than do other states. But even a state like that is limited to some extent because they're members of other regimes, which means they're also subject to international law. If you took, for example, France or Germany, they're within the structure of the EU. Are they sovereign states? Yes. But what does it mean for them to be sovereign states? Can they simply act unilaterally? Well, no, because they're subject to EU law as well as to their own institutions and constitutional structures. So I want to suggest that sovereignty is not something that should be overstated either as an ethical ideal or as a description. There is sovereign authority, there is sovereign power, but it varies, and over the years it will change. Those who are advocates of strong forms of state sovereignty, I think sometimes are actually unrealistic because they don't recognize the extent to which states are in fact compromised. The United States has a great deal of power, but if you are, say, a country like Haiti, there isn't really much sovereign power, even though technically, as a member of the United Nations, you are a nation like any other with the same rights and so on. But that's not the reality.
I think there is a good example of what you are speaking about when you consider, for instance, International Monetary Fund and debts of the countries, for instance, Argentina. So Argentina as a country can't just say that, oh, today we have a debt to the International Monetary Fund like that, but tomorrow we will adopt a special legislation and this debt will be erased or something like that. So I think this is also part of the sovereignty that the state operates within. So that's quite interesting moment. The next thing in your theory, when I was reading your book, and that's very interesting, is the question of minimal state, or in other words, what sort of state do you need to function this theory? And this is, I think, fascinating topic. Let's explain, what does it mean, a minimal state, in your understanding?
Okay. So the notion of a minimal state is not something that I discuss explicitly, in part because I think the problem with the notion of the minimal state in contemporary writing is that it's really underexplained, under-theorized. To give you, one kind of example, let's say you took a state that has very, very limited engagement in welfare provision, has a huge defense budget because it is deeply under threat for whatever reasons, historical or contemporary. Now, would that be a minimal state? How do we assess it? Do we assess it in terms of the proportion of its budget that's devoted to state functions, even though the number of functions is very small, the amount of taxation and revenue it raises in order to fulfill its very, very few functions is really quite extensive. At the other extreme, you could imagine a state that has, significant welfare provision, is engaged in education, is engaged in providing all kinds of public services, but has almost no defense budget, spends relatively little. Now, would that be a minimal state? What is the standard here for describing a state as minimal? And can one have a theory that says what should be the extent of the state, regardless of its circumstances, whether it's a state that's perpetually on a war footing, whether it's a state that is extremely poor, or if it's a state that is extremely wealthy? These are all going to be different circumstances. If you took, a country like India, is that going to be described as a minimal state on the grounds that it has very little income taxation, mainly because there isn't enough of a tax base there in the general population? Or are we going to describe it as an extensive state because it's engaged in all kinds of other things? So I don't think in the end that the notion of a minimal state is really a very useful one. I think we can talk more generally about what kinds of things are appropriate for a state to be engaged in, what kinds of things are necessary for a state to do. But I think a lot of this is going to be historically contingent. So I'm not sure that simply saying, we want a minimal or an extensive or a very extensive state is the best way to go theoretically.
And also, when we say minimum state as a definition, then it's very difficult to find an example. So yes. when we speak about democratic governments as a model, your theory, is it challenging democratic governance or is it complementing it? Is it possible to even answer that question?
Yes, that's a good question. I think overall, in the modern world, there's a lot to be said for democracy, but I would be very careful about simply advocating democratic institutions regardless of political circumstances. I think one of the first things one has to recognize in talking about democracy is that democracy can take all kinds of shapes and forms. It's not as if we live in a world or have ever lived in a world where we've said, okay, what we want is democracy, and we can just pick up a standard model and apply it, as if all that matters is thinking about, how we ensure that the populace has a vote to decide either on practical policies or to decide on the selection of representatives, which is the most common form of democracy today. And the reason I think it's complicated is that, firstly, there are all kinds of voting systems that are out there which will, make a difference to the outcome of any democratic process. And there are all kinds of ways in which democracies impose institutional constraints on the legislature, on the executive, and indeed on the very process of selecting representatives or making democratic decisions. So in asking, whether or not democracy is something desirable or compatible with the view I've got, I would want to say immediately, well, okay, it depends on the kind of society that we're talking about, and it depends on what kind of democratic processes and procedures you want. Again, to take a kind of hypothetical example, if you have a system which has, let's say in the UK, a first past the post system, you'll get one kind of democratic outcome. If you have some form of proportional representation or a single transferable vote, you'll get a different kind of outcome. So it doesn't matter which kinds of institutions you've got. I would say yes, it will depend on a country's demography, on its ethnic composition. It'll depend on historical realities. But then, if we recognize that all of these things make a difference, how do we figure out what kinds of institutions should shape the kind of democracy we have? And that can't be decided democratically, because by hypothesis, we need to have those institutions of democracy in place before we can put it to democratic decision-making. But that decision-making cannot determine the structure of the institutions in the first place. So I think the whole question of democracy is more complicated than I think is often recognized. And sometimes, democratic institutions may be positively harmful if you've got particular kinds of societies. For example, if you had a society in which there were substantial ethnic tensions, with some ethnic groups in a significant minority, if you move to a democratic process from, let's say, a monarchy, it may well be that the majority exercises its power in ways that are extremely harmful, not only to the minority, but maybe to the society overall. So one has to think about all of these things when thinking about institutions.
Absolutely. And when we speak about elections, democracy, and institutions, then, there is also a moment, or there is a notion of nomination. And this is also very interesting, because sometimes you have a democratic system, but you as a citizen can't really influence the nomination. Mm-hmm. And that's a very good debate, especially when it comes to some systems where people must select between one or the second candidate, but that's it. There is nothing else. So sometimes you have a majority of people who just can't decide, and they are staying outside of this democratic system. and they are just observing how the system works, but they are not participating in. So I think this is also quite interesting thought.
Yes, it's always a problem that somebody has to set the agenda. Now, you could say that we have a democratic process for setting the agenda, but that still will require some kind of exercise of power or authority to set the terms by which the agenda is set democratically. So at some point, there will be an exercise of power that is not subject to democratic deliberation. And so, this in a way tells you something about the limits of democracy. It's not an argument against democracy, but it is an argument of an argument to say, do not expect too much of this or more than this form of governance can deliver. Like with any system of governance, it has its advantages, but there are trade-offs.
And I think we both know about this because we came to different country and we started sort of a new life. And there is a particular period of time when you try to fit in a society, but you don't participate in political processes because you are like a worker or you are a skilled worker and you have particular visas. So there is a significant portion of society living within the society, and they are trying to fit, but sometimes they don't have the tools or instruments how to influence the processes. So therefore, it's good to go through the freer theory because it provides some interesting perspectives. So let's go to the next notion, and that's the multiculturalism and integration policies. And I would like to know, how do you see the perspective of the current debates about integration? We know that there are some states that are promoting multiculturalism, but also they are imposing special policies for this multiculturalism.
Across the world, there are clearly very different policies that go under the label multiculturalism. On the whole, I think in political debate, as debate that's initiated or contributed to by political figures, I think on the whole, that debate doesn't tell you very much that's helpful, because what that debate, I think, reflects is the political interests of various leaderships. So, for example, it's not unusual for people in politics to say things like multiculturalism has failed. Okay? As if, and so people like Angela Merkel has said this in the past. The former UK Prime Minister David Cameron has said it. I think Suella Braverman has said it in the UK. But I think these sorts of statements are more or less meaningless, because it's not as if there was at any point a kind of explicit decision taken to start a completely new initiative and then work with it and then see whether it has succeeded, and then we've reached a point such that we can say, okay, no, let's just change all of this. All of these things have actually evolved over time in response to very particular kinds of political problems. Why did we have multiculturalism in Australia? Well, we had it because after the Second World War, Australia had a significant labor shortage. They wanted to attract people. They paid people to come in from Europe, from Greece, Yugoslavia, and Italy. Lots of people came in from Southern Europe, especially. After 20 years of being here, they decided they wanted to return home because, they did not feel at home in their new society. Australia did not want to lose these people, so they thought what we need to do is to encourage them to stay by saying, we're much more welcoming of cultural diversity and of your own traditions and practices and so on. So the policy evolved in that way. it's not as if now you can turn around and say, well, this policy has failed. It's something that has evolved over a long period of time. It's not a single policy. It's a whole history. You can't just turn around and say that this history has been a mistake. Of course, you may need to modify or adjust the policies that you've got. But within the debate, as I was saying at the outset, there's a lot of talk as if what you've seen is a kind of explicit taking of a comprehensive policy off the shelf and applying it. That's simply not the way that things have happened. Now, among those defenders and critics of multiculturalism who are a bit more thoughtful about this, I think there are two different kinds of perspectives. One which says, look, we need to go further to recognize the identity concerns of cultural minorities for a variety of reasons. Some want to say this from the perspective of some kind of account of what's just. Others want to do it from a more practical point of view. And on the other hand, there are those who are more critical of policies like multiculturalism who want to say, well, what we are worried about is the move towards a kind of identity politics which is disruptive to social unity. I think both these perspectives have something, on their side. It's reasonable enough to say, okay, if the existence of cultural diversity that's made too much a part of the political agenda, this can be politically disruptive. It can lead to tension and conflict. Okay, I think that's reasonable. So we need to think about how we describe, how we institutionalize these attempts that we've made to accommodate diversity. And I think within the debate, what I would always press for is a kind of attempt to lower the temperature rather than to reassert we must have let's say Britain first. And equally, I think we need to lower the temperature by not going to the extent of saying Britain is a racist nation and all of these minorities have been consistently oppressed and everything needs to be changed in that way. So I think, from my point of view, what is needed generally is a much more moderate approach to these questions. In political life, of course, this is not going to happen because people are advocates with different motives. So, this is something I think we simply have to work through. I don't think there's an institutional solution. I don't think there's a single policy solution. I think it's something we're just going to have to live with.
How does your theory see the universal values? Because when we speak about multiculturalism, some people might immediately think about some regulations about what sort of values those people should adopt when living in different countries or communities. And universal values or universal norms, that's something that people are speaking about. So what's your perspective on that?
So generally speaking, I don't think there are any universal values in the sense that there are values that are accepted everywhere. I think there are lots of values that are widely shared, but universal, I think, is too strong a claim. Now, here someone would usually say to me in response, well, what about murder? Surely that's, that murder is wrong, surely that's a universal value. And here I would simply say, well, what murder means is wrongful killing. So by definition, okay, wrongful killing is wrong. Everyone accepts that, but that's simply an analytical truth. What is disagreed about is what counts as murder. Is abortion murder? Is euthanasia murder? Is capital punishment murder? There are all kinds of differences. So there are lots of norms that in the abstract are universal. People, of course, value friendship. They value truth-telling. They value kindness and so on. But once you get to the point of considering what counts as being truthful, what counts as being just, what counts as being kind, then there is a diversity of viewpoints, and these, I think, need to be to some degree accommodated. Compromises need to be found. It won't do to say what we're going to go for is an attempt to find some kind of rational answer to these questions so that we can establish once and for all what is right and what is wrong. I just don't think that's possible, even though there are very, very wide areas of agreement. So if we take this perspective to reflecting on the politics of multiculturalism or of cultural diversity more broadly, what I would say is that we should think about society as a kind of ongoing area of debate and conflict about fundamental values. And these are never going to be settled. But what we can have is better and worse ways of accommodating the differences that we have in our ethical perspectives. Ideally, what you would have is a great deal of overlap, a great deal of consensus, but at the margins, there will always be ferocious disagreements. And this is something that just has to be managed.
One of the concepts that you are working with is the notion of freedom of association. Mm-hmm. And I have two questions about this. Firstly, how does it work in practice, or how it should work in practice? And the second question was about citizenship. If I am British or Italian and I want to go, let's say, to Malaysia or France or India, I want to join the community, how does it work? Because this is something that people should consider when speaking about this notion.
Okay. So on the question of freedom of association, now this is something that I want to advance as an ideal that I think is very important, and it derives from a starting point that says that in principle, no one has any right or authority to require me to conform to their preferences, to their views of what's right and wrong. I don't recognize any initial authority of some people over others. So if that's the case, then how do people get along? Well, again, ideally, they would get along because they decide that they want to associate with those people who are of like mind. Now, it doesn't mean they can do this ab initio, because we're born into families, we're born into societies. It's not as if we make this decision from the beginning. But what I want to say is that given that no one has any authority over me, if I do not want to associate with them, if I do not want to conform to their views about the way things should be, I should be free to dissociate myself from them. This is, I think, the most fundamental freedom that I should be able to claim. I don't think I can claim anything more than this if it means imposing on other people demands that they have no obligation to me to fulfill. So if this is the case, then if there is that kind of freedom for me to leave, I should also be free then to go and associate with others, but only provided they want to associate with me. What will be the outcome of this, I think, is that you will get a whole set of compromises. Okay, many people won't leave the associations or the communities that they're in, because it's too much trouble, it's too costly, it's too difficult. They haven't really thought about it. They simply go about things because they're accustomed to doing so. But at the margins, there will be people who are dissatisfied. And I think for me, in a free society, they should be at liberty to move on, whether it's move on geographically or to move on in terms of the relationships that they choose to have. In reality, I think what we're going to see is, as I said before, a limited extent to which people will actually move on, because this is a costly thing. I would want to describe a free society as one in which people associate freely. They associate with one another because that's what they want. But what they want is never going to be what their first preference is. What they want is what compromise they're willing to accept. Now, then, to go to your second question about citizenship and movement between different countries. So I, given my views about association, think both that people should be free to associate with others who want them, and others should be free to welcome them. So anything that's going to form a barrier to people associating in this way, I think is undesirable. It's a limitation on people's freedom. In the case of immigration, both on the freedom of those who want to move and a limitation on the freedom of those who want to welcome them. If I want to move to Malaysia and I have people there who want to employ me or to simply associate with me, but the government says, no, I may not move, that's both a limitation on my freedom and it's a limitation on the freedom of those people in Malaysia. Okay? At the same time, it has to be recognized as a reality that those people in Malaysia themselves exist in a social structure which doesn't give them the right to determine unilaterally the laws of the country, who may come in and who may not. And I'm not going to say, well, I wanting to move there have some kind of absolute right to determine what should be the norms and the laws of that country. All I want to claim is that to the extent that those laws, institutions prevent me from moving, this is a bad thing. This is a limitation on freedom on both sides. And of course, in the world, some countries are more hospitable to movement. Some countries are less. I'm now living in Greece, which has been very hospitable to me. But had I wanted to move somewhere else, it might have been much more difficult.
Right. You already mentioned migration. And when we speak about the European Union and migration, there are some sort of public secrets. For instance, we have a big migration camp in Turkey. And there is a big issue between the European Union and Turkey, how to handle those people. But when we say people, it means like 2-3 million people. It's not like 10,000 people. So how would you, based on your theory, create or develop a perspective on possible solutions for these big issues when it comes to migration? The another thing is should we welcome more migrants or less migrants? Migrants from which countries? So there are so many regulations and there are so many imposed policies. And some states are even sophisticated in this, and they are applying sort of high-skilled worker schemes where they set up the parameters of what sort of people they want to come to the country. So we have this complexity of migration. So how is your theory dealing with that?
So both in my book, The Liberal Archipelago, and then more recently in my book, Immigration and Freedom, I both implicitly and explicitly am in favor of greater freedom of movement. The difficulty in practical or political terms is not that the movement of people will create all the problems that advocates of immigration restriction suggest. It's not going to be an economic problem, and indeed, on the whole, it's going to be an economic boon to those places that welcome more immigrants. But the problem is a political one. Firstly, let's say we took the European cases in countries like Britain and France and Germany and Sweden, as immigration focuses on movement to a few European countries, and most immigrants coming into Europe from outside Europe and the EU in particular tend to want to go to a very few countries. Most immigrants are not really interested in moving to Slovakia or Hungary or the Czech Republic or Austria. They really want to get to Germany or to Sweden, France, or the UK. So those countries then become much more hostile to immigration. So the question is, if you're going to manage immigration, but there are going to be these bottlenecks, there will be pressures, that are unavoidable political pressures. So in a way, I think this has to be a kind of a European solution rather than unilateral country solutions. The practical reality is that in all of these countries, political leaders have to be mindful of the politics within their own countries. So I don't see an obvious political solution right now, because even though a continent of 500 million people could very easily absorb 3 or 4 or 5 million immigrants from around the world, but the way in which the movement takes place, which is shaped by the absence of a kind of coherent European policy, I think is what's creating a lot of the problem. Similarly, if you took a case like the United States, okay, clearly right now the southern border of the United States is the biggest topic when it comes to immigration. Why are there so many people coming into the United States through this channel? Okay? And this is a form of movement that's very, very visible, creates a lot of anxiety, makes people worried, especially if anti-immigrant advocates point to it and talk up the problem. But of course, a part of the problem is that for many people who are trying to get to the United States in this way, other legal avenues are not available to them. Just as it's very difficult for people from Africa to get to Europe through legal channels, even if you're highly educated and highly qualified and a very desirable worker. If you're from Nigeria or Ghana, for example, it's hard even to get a visa to visit. And I'd say this from practical experience, trying to host a conference of scholars from Africa at the LSE a few years ago. Many of them just couldn't come because they couldn't get a visa. So if there were more regularized channels available, I think many of these problems would also diminish. But I think the politics of it is the source of the problem, rather than the actual fact of a movement of people. In the long term, of course, I think there's nothing much you can do to stop the movement of people. It's simply going against the tide of history. Just as Europeans are spread out across the world, so will Asians and Africans and Europeans and South Americans. People will go in search of safety, in search of economic opportunity, in search of like-minded people, to flee persecution, all kinds of reasons. And I think in the long run, there's really nothing you can do to stop it. But I don't see a politics that's going to manage this any better than we're managing it now.
Yeah, that's very insightful, because when you consider all those people, some different purposes and reasons for moving, and then you have that generalization that they face. That's quite that's a very interesting topic to research and to speak about it as well.
About 12 years ago, I went to Prague to debate immigration with one of the Czech members of the European Parliament and another scholar in the Czech Republic, an historian. And it was in the town hall. Actually, there was a translator because I don't speak Czech. But what was interesting was that the audience was generally very, very worried about immigration and hostile to it. But everybody recognized that Czechoslovakia or the Czech Republic did not have an immigration problem because people were not coming to the Czech Republic. They were sometimes coming through it to get to Germany or to Sweden or to France. But even though everybody agreed that there was no immigration problem, they were against the immigration. And I think that tells you something about the way in which the issue has become turned into something that's extremely sensitive and troubling, even for people who are not going to be affected by it.
One of the notions that I noticed when reading your book was tolerance. And after reading a few pages, I got the questions for myself. And that was, do we know how to work with tolerance? And do we know how to integrate tolerance into our policies, regulations, or laws? So can you please say a few words about your perspective on tolerance? And also, what does it mean to have that active attitude to tolerance instead of just speaking about it?
Okay. So the reason for my emphasizing tolerance as a kind of guiding principle has to do with my concern both theoretically and practically on the emphasis on justice. As you know, that in the literature and political theory, over the last 50 years, justice has been the most significant ethical ideal that's been debated, and various theories have been advanced about what it is that justice demands. And my worry is that this emphasis on justice is harmful or even dangerous, to the extent that it's in the nature of the ideal of justice that it's uncompromising. John Rawls says this explicitly at the beginning of his book, A Theory of Justice. Anything that's unjust cannot be tolerated. He simply says justice is uncompromising. And I think what we need are more compromising virtues, because if we tie ourselves to notions like justice, then immediately what we have is that question, well, what does justice require? And what we'll immediately observe is that there are many, many views about what justice requires. How do we then mediate these differences? And I think that what we need to do is find institutions and norms which okay, recognize that there are continuing debates about what is right and what is wrong, but nonetheless also recognize that these things cannot be settled. They can't be settled philosophically. The evidence of this is that they haven't been, even after decades or centuries of trying, and they certainly can't be settled practically. Okay, all we can do really is to find some way of compromising so that we can get on with the business of living, even as we continue to disagree. So here, I just think that the idea of tolerance is very useful because what it suggests is an attitude of compromise, of give and take, of listening to the other side, and agreeing to disagree. So I think what we need here is both an attitude of toleration, which is something that should be encouraged, but also I think we need institutions that are better shaped by this. I think to some extent we do in fact have this in the institutions of the modern West to a significant degree, because on the whole, whether you're looking at France or Germany or the United States or Canada or Australia, or for the matter of you're looking at countries like Malaysia and Singapore, there's a very high degree of acceptance that in politics you can't get your own way all the time. So we will compromise all the time. We will make accommodations. And I think what we need to recognize is that this is the stuff of politics. It's not the pursuit of justice. It's not the pursuit of the right. It's a matter of trying to find ways of accommodating one another. So I think the tendencies that go against this are coming from both left and right extremes of politics. One looking for a kind of social unity that wants to emphasize, say, the unity of the nation, and the other side wanting to emphasize the opposite. And I think both things are dangerous to the extent that they're uncompromising.
Right. The last questions for today's interview. And let's go a little bit into security dimension. And at the moment, we have so many interventions in the world because we have many conflicts as well. And some people say sometimes the state as an actor in international relations is intervening too much, or it's going into some sort of dramatic interventions. And we have many examples from the past, like Iraq, we have Libya, we have African countries, Asia as well, but also in Europe. So how is your perspective on intervention in terms of international relations when we have a state as an actor?
Right. I agree that there have been too many interventions, but I think this is an area where it's very difficult to have a general theory. Let's take a practical case like the US-led intervention in Iraq in 2003. I thought at the time that it was a bad idea, but the world was definitely divided on this question. I think in retrospect, it is a case of a very, very bad intervention that created all kinds of outcomes which are creating even more problems. So, okay. But can one use this, for example, as a way of developing a general theory of intervention? I don't think so, because there may be other cases where intervention is warranted. It also raises another obvious question: is that, well, what counts as intervention? Is intervention simply a matter of military engagement, or is there already intervention if it takes place through softer forms of the exercise of power? For example, let's take the case of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Western response. Does that count as an intervention on the part of the Western powers? They're not sending soldiers in there. They're not sending troops or personnel, but they are sending weapons. They are sending money. They are sending aid of various sorts. Does that count as an intervention? Well, I don't think there's a straightforward answer to this, because every answer, can be presented with a reasonable degree of plausibility. Does criticizing Russia count as an intervention? So in this particular case, I want to say that the support of Ukraine is completely warranted. But if you look at the United States, the Republican Party is a party that holds a completely different view, even though historically they've also been supportive of other forms of intervention. So I can't give you a very good answer to this, other than to say, well, on a case-by-case basis, we'll have to look at political circumstances, history, and make strategic considerations as well. What would it mean to simply abandon Ukraine, not only for the fate of the Ukrainians, but for the geopolitical order, for security in Europe, if there is a power like Russia that's moving unchecked, when it's invaded another country. I don't think these questions can be resolved straightforwardly by appeal to some general principles.
Thank you very much for your insightful thoughts and giving us or sharing with us different perspectives on a world that we live in. And I think that the theory of diversity and freedom, it's fascinating reading, because there are so many notions and concepts you might agree or disagree with, but they are provoking some very good questions. And sometimes it's much more difficult to find those answers for those questions. So again, thank you for sharing your insights with us.